Okay, welcome back, everybody. Thank you. Thank you. Don't make me use my teacher voice. I'm David Devlin-Foltz. I'm the Vice President of Impact Assessment at the Aspen Institute, and I'm very happy to be moderating this panel, which will talk about how we know it's working. How can we capture the impact of virtual exchange programs like the Stevens Initiative? And I'm very excited to have the opportunity to be here with a team from RTI, which I still think of as Research Triangle Institute, but popularly known by its initials. Like so many things in Washington, D.C., we only need an acronym. But RTI undertook the really challenging task, I say this as an evaluator, the really challenging task of trying to capture the impact of this initiative. And we'll be hearing today about early results, early findings from RTI's evaluation project, but something that lays the groundwork for the work that they'll be doing over the duration of the project. And I think it's a great opportunity for the many professionals in this field who are in the room to contribute their own thoughts about how they think about assessment and what else this project might capture. And as the team from RTI will explain, this is a developmental evaluation, which is a term of art, which means from an evaluator's standpoint, we're making up the evaluation as the project goes along. But I say that respectfully because that is the typical practice and a route that my team here at the Aspen Institute has occasion to pursue with some of our clients, where the project really is new, where it really is developing, where we don't know exactly how it's going to proceed from the outset. And so the evaluation needs to evolve as the project itself evolves. But that's enough for me. We're going to hear from the experts at RTI in just a moment. So I'm going to turn first to David Silver, who's going to give us an overview of RTI as an organization. And then just to give you the order of battle here, next up will be Jen Laird, sitting here immediately to my left, who will talk about the methodological approach that RTI is taking, followed by Jaylan Elrahman, who will talk about an overview of the semi-annual report that RTI has just released a couple of months ago. And finally, we'll come back to Jen, who's going to talk about the product of some very, very, very recent site visits that she and colleagues undertook to Morocco to see some of the projects in the field. So I'll turn it over to David now to give us the overview of RTI.
Thank you. So as David said, I'll give a brief overview of our approach to the work, the methods in the study, and Jen and Jaylan will talk about initial findings and some more detail about the methodology. I'll also give a brief introduction to the organization, RTI, and to our center, or actually two groups at RTI that are involved in this work. I can't advance the slide. So that is a photo of our headquarters in North Carolina. We're a fairly enormous mission-based nonprofit. We've got almost 5,000 employees. And we have 11 offices in the US and 11 internationally. And we work in many, many more places than that. The organization, one of the sort of unique things about the organization, I think, is just the breadth. We have, the mission is essentially to using sort of the whole continuum of research to practice, to make an impact, a positive impact on the world. Our center, which I'll describe in more detail, has a breadth of evaluation and research methods, and I think what's unique about that is we can sort of bring the tools to the problem rather than try to fit the research problem or evaluation problem into our specific areas of expertise. And because we're in an organization of 5,000, we can draw from statisticians, and there are engineers, there are educators and health people and international development people. So we really have a wealth of expertise to draw from. go to the next slide. So this is the key players in the team that is doing this evaluation. A couple who couldn't be here, unfortunately. Sonia Moldovan comes from our international development group. Her expertise is in measurement and evaluation and learning. Christina has actually just gotten back from Morocco, so she couldn't be here. She's got young children at home, and she thought that was more important. Jen, on the other hand, was also in Morocco.
I have teenagers, they can wait.
So Jen is the project director on the team. Christina is a senior researcher, and Jaylan is a junior researcher on the team. I think that's everyone. And I am the director of our Center for Evaluation and the Study of Educational Equity, of which everyone except Sonia is a part. So with that, I think I'll get a little bit into our approach to the work. Can we advance?
Next slide.
All right. So as David was saying, I don't need to say too much more about developmental evaluation, except that if it were only about learning, designing the evaluation as we go, that would apply to all of our evaluations. What's special about developmental evaluation is that it is focused on sort of nascent programs often, where the primary interest is not in a summative assessment of whether things are working or not, or even what works and what doesn't definitively, but what do we need to know to improve the work? And developmental evaluation has a big focus on helping stakeholders use data, collect the data that's necessary sometimes to set the stage for an impact evaluation down the line. But most importantly, to make sense of the data and to think collaboratively, for us to think collaboratively with the awardees, for instance, to understand what's important to make the work better, as well as to document what's going particularly well and where the pain points are. A key part of really all of the evaluation we do is focus on engaging stakeholders. I think you can't do a good evaluation without getting plenty of input from the stakeholders, and in this case, as many of you know, we have a group of stakeholders that are actively involved in, quarterly meetings?
Bi-monthly and now quarterly, yeah.
To give feedback on the evaluation, to ask questions, and to help guide our work, do things like review surveys. In general, I think evaluators probably don't pay enough attention to the extent to which the subjects of the evaluation are have critical information to share with us to help us understand the work. So those evaluation groups help with that. We also understand or understood early on in this process that many or most of you have internal evaluations, and we're not one of those evaluation groups that feels that impartiality is so important that we don't want information that may be biased by people doing the work. Rather, we take impartiality seriously, but we also recognize that there's a lot of work already going into understanding the programs, that we want to take advantage of the evaluation people who have been hired by awardees or within the awardee organizations. So that's an important component of our evaluation. Finally, the idea of culturally competent evaluation is something that we take seriously, and it's not, by that I don't mean that we expect to be experts in the cultures of North Africa and the Middle East, we rather recognize how important it is to be sensitive to cultural differences, and not just culture in the traditional sense, but cultures within cultures, educational culture, as you heard earlier. I think that was a great example of why it's important to pay attention to cultural issues. If we're trying to study engagement, it may mean something very different in a different culture, the implications for measurement may be very different. If we had used a traditional measure of engagement that we often use in a school in the U.S., in that context, I think it would appear that people were disengaged when in fact they were sort of working within the norms of their culture. That there are myriad of ways. I don't think even within the U.S. context, that could be an issue comparing a school in D.C. with private school in Bethesda. So what's important about culturally competent evaluation is that we part of the process is to try to recognize our blind spots. It's part of why we engage stakeholders, and we sort of start with the assumption that we need to be aware, both in the way we design the evaluation, design surveys, and the way we interpret the results of the evaluation, since there probably is no perfect measure for many of the constructs that we're trying to track. Can we go to the next slide? So just wanted to talk about some of our research questions. We'll flash up most or almost all of the important ones that are part of this evaluation, and I'll just briefly describe a few of them. Where sort of the overarching goal is to look at the strengths and weaknesses of the work to date, with an eye again to helping to inform all of the awardees about what people's experience has been with success and what the struggles have been. One of the key parts of this evaluation is to look at promising practices, and we're interested in the attributes and designs that are most promising. And that, I think it's important to differentiate that from looking at sort of which programs are high performing or low performing. That's not part of our charge, and it's not something we're interested in, but we are interested in things that happen in many places that sort of are promising practices that could be adopted by others, or common struggles that people have that we can help inform solutions to. Can we go to the next slide? Part of the evaluation is also about communication of these practices. So that's an important question, is how are you all disseminating and communicating information, and how we can as well. The evaluation, I think, aligns pretty well with what Elliot spoke about earlier. In many ways, one is that which is the way it should be. We are interested in getting a handle on what the reach of the work has been so far, as well as what the outlook looks like for expanding. And finally, I would just say that this is not it's really not an impact evaluation, although we're very concerned about setting the stage for impact, for understanding in a qualitative sense what's going well and less well. But we're also, in the way we're setting up our data collection, we're working with awardees to try to put in place the building blocks for a potentially a more rigorous evaluation of impact. And that means working with you all to create the best measures, to understand the important outcomes, and to both understand what you're doing that we can learn from, and to help refine the approach to measurement that you have, so that when the time comes, when things are more mature in the virtual exchange world, you'll have what you need, hopefully, to really demonstrate a strong level of evidence.
Great. Next slide, please. So I'll talk a little bit more about our components and methods. First, we developed a monitoring and evaluation plan where we drafted research questions, identified potential indicators and data methods to address those questions. And we did that by reading a lot of materials shared by the Aspen Institute, both of their strategy documents and logic models, and materials from the awardees. And we had a one-day workshop with the Aspen Institute staff, the Stevens Initiative staff, and representatives from the two main funding groups, the State Department and Basil's Family Foundation, to really refine our plans. And soon after that, we established the evaluation working group. This includes a representative from each of the 10 awardees, as well as the two largest funders. And as David mentioned, we met initially bi-monthly, and now we're moving to a quarterly process. And one of the things we wanted to do was try to identify a common set of survey items. We knew that each of the awardees were doing some data collection themselves. Many were already doing surveys of participants, and in some cases, teachers and facilitators. We didn't want to ask for another separate set of surveys. We wanted to leverage those activities, and we wanted to try to identify a small set of common items that would be appropriate for all or most of the programs. So we did that by looking at what some of the existing programs have already been asking, and a few items bubbled up and that have some research basis behind them. So those common items are being implemented this spring. We're going to show you some results from this fall, and at that point, some of those items were used by a few programs, but they weren't yet used by almost all of the programs. So the data collection are surveys from participants and sometimes teachers and facilitators. We just got through with an amazing set of site visits, which I'll share some initial results for in a moment. We're using also a method called Most Significant Change Stories, and this is an opportunity for the programs themselves to collect some qualitative data in a structured format, and I think twice a year, we're asking that programs submit 2 significant change stories, and that becomes a qualitative basis of data for us as well. And then we'll do some additional key informant interviews. When we go on site, we try to observe the exchange, whether it's synchronous or asynchronous. We have a focus group or group interviews, or sometimes one-on-one interviews with participants. We interview the facilitator, our teacher, and other stakeholders involved in that program. In the fall, we want to broaden our interviews. We think there are some people who aren't directly involved in some of these programs that will have important perspectives about the field in general, where it's gone in the last few years, and so we'll do those in the fall. Next slide, please. To give you a sense of our timeline, this is a 2-year evaluation. We're just now finishing the first year. And so, again, we started with a monitoring and evaluation plan. We're engaging the evaluation stakeholders almost throughout the life of the project. When it comes to doing our final report, we'll ask for their feedback on presentation and different messaging that'll be important for different stakeholders. The survey data collection, some programs were implementing in the fall, most programs were implementing in the fall actually, and did surveys, although at that point we didn't have our current survey items identified. So there wasn't that piece, but in the spring we are going to have that, so we'll have those data in the summer. And then I've mentioned site visits. We'll do some more in the fall. We are producing semi-annual reports. We have a draft of one that we've shared with the Stevens Initiative in March, and after this meeting, we will share it with all the awardees as well, and then we'll have a final report at the end of the 2 years.
Great, thank you. So as Jen mentioned, we are charged with developing several reports in our role as evaluators, and just this past March, we submitted a draft of our second semi-annual report to the Stevens Initiative, which basically offered a summary of our evaluation activities to date, focusing chiefly on fall 2016 implementation of grant recipient programs. And that would be actually the first time that all 10 of the grantees have implemented their program since we've been involved as evaluators. So that allowed us to develop a little more comprehensive overview in this particular report. As Jen mentioned, our team plans to submit a final version of this report fairly soon with some updated data from awardees, as well as some refinement to the report based on feedback from the Stevens Initiative. Once we do finalize that report, we do hope to share with awardees in the room, though all program names will be anonymized. So programs might be able to see how their unique data relates to larger trends among all 10 of the awardees, but program names will not be associated with any data points. So that is our plan. So awardees in the audience can expect to receive a version of that report in the foreseeable future. So a little bit about what is included in the report. Our team was able to articulate some preliminary observations and trends based on several sources of data. First, we looked at data on program attributes and reach, looking particularly at participant demographics. And we had 7 out of our 10 awardees submit information about their participants, and that included location, by state in the US or by country in the Mena region. Some awardees included information about gender, some included information about school age, and there were a couple of awardees who also included information if participants came from traditionally marginalized populations, refugee youth, homeless youth, youth in Title I schools in the US, and students in rural areas. Second, we looked at survey data that the awardees collected as part of their own internal evaluations. We had 7 out of our 10 awardees submit information about their fall 2016 implementation based on their internal evaluations. And most of those surveys were conducted among participants, but there was some information about surveys completed by educators as well, which was interesting to look at. Again, as David and Jen mentioned, most of these surveys were developed and administered by awardees themselves, so they were designed in variable ways. They might have been collecting similar participant information or common outputs and outcomes, but because they were so variable, it made it very difficult for us to be able to aggregate the data and present it in that way. But what we were able to do is create common categories of outputs and outcomes and discuss some general trends in the data from there. So we'll talk about that in a few. As Jen mentioned, we do collect most significant change stories from awardees, which again are an opportunity for awardees to share powerful anecdotes about impact. RTI also hosted several reflection sessions with representatives from each of the awardees, which is an opportunity for awardees to come together and unpack common challenges, discuss some promising practices, and engage with one another as colleagues in the field of virtual exchange. And then we also took a look and incorporated data from quarterly reports that awardees submitted. So yeah, those were really the data sources that we used to provide the meat to the report that was really structured around central research questions that we articulated in the monitoring evaluation plan. The relevant questions that we focused on in this particular report included reach and scope. It included questions around, to what extent Stevens is really achieving the goals that they're trying to achieve in terms of outcomes and outputs, and then successes, challenges, lessons learned from folks on the ground. So can we keep going? So let's dig into some of the program details and give you all a sense of who Stevens is supporting, who the awardees are serving, and how they're serving them. So in terms of age level, we had awardees tell us participants range from as young as middle school to as old as college level students. Length of program varied quite a bit, with some programs lasting certainly less than a couple of months, some lasting as long as full academic years. The amount of hours that awardees or participants engaged with the program and the curriculum within those timeframes also varied quite a bit. With an interesting finding, actually, that students based in the Mena region actually spent more hours engaged in program curriculum than their counterparts in the US. So that's something interesting. All awardees had asynchronous components to their exchange experience, and a couple also had some synchronous elements, though those look different depending on capacity of the program and context. Many of the programs were embedded in a class or course context, but there were some programs that were also separate and distinct from school settings, including video game platforms. And then content focus varied quite a bit as well. As we've heard already, there were some programs that were focusing on discussions around political issues, gender and Islam, public health. There were programs that were more collaborative in nature, producing a project, a science-based project. And then there was some more straightforward, like language exchanges. So there was quite a variability there. So there were certainly some similarities across programs, but each of the programs definitely had their very unique flavor, which really showcased just how many forms productive virtual exchange can take. And I think that makes for a very dynamic session and forum today as you all engage with each other. Can we proceed to the next? All right, so we have some charts and graphs for you all to sort of visualize who and where people are in each of these programs. So this is a map of the US. And we can see that there's a fair distribution across the states. There's significant representation from states like New York, Virginia, Kentucky, and even right here in DC. Let's keep moving. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is the Mena region as well. We had a significant amount of students in Morocco, where I think all of our awardees actually have site locations. Tunis, Jordan. Next slide, please. Of those who submitted information about age, it's pretty clear that the vast majority of participants fall within the high school category. Next slide, thank you. Again, of those who submitted information about gender, it seems like there's a fair balance and distribution between genders across locations. Next slide. Great, so across the various programs, we saw that students generally reported a high satisfaction with their experience in the programs. One interesting finding that we sort of want to elevate in this space is that students in the Mena region tended to rate their experiences slightly higher than students in the US, and that was consistent across programs. So we've wrestled with some of the potential reasons why that may be and come up with a few theories, but we're definitely interested in hearing from folks in the room as well about what their interpretation of that data is. So it certainly can be that Mena-based participants are just having more positive experiences than people in the US. That could be that they are engaging with the program in for more time than US-based students. So it could just be that they are having a better time with the programs. It could be that there are like social, political, or societal factors intersecting in a way that make students based in the Mena region more apt to provide positive or non-critical responses in a written platform. Or it could be that students in the Mena region are also just deriving satisfaction from the program, from components of the program that are tangential to the exchange itself, such as having more consistent and sustained access to technology in a classroom setting. So those are things to keep in mind. But as I said, we're definitely interested to hear how folks in the room interpret findings like these, because you guys are definitely closer to the programs on the ground, and we value your insights. So next slide. So yeah, one of the overarching goals of the Stevens Initiative is to increase cross-cultural empathy and understanding and feeling of commonality between groups of people. So different programs measure this in different ways, but one of the instruments, the survey instruments that 4 of the awardees used was the self-other overlap measure that was developed by Dr. Emile Bruno out of MIT. It is a measure that is designed to be implemented pre- and post-program to measure how students progress in feelings of commonality towards another group. And research has shown that high scores on this particular measure is correlated with feelings of compassion, trust, pro-social behavior, and more cooperative exchange. So we had 4 of our awardees use this measure, and there were slight increases from pre- and post-program on this particular measure, as well as other measures that programs chose to use to measure cross-cultural empathy and commonality understanding. What we do want people to be aware of, though this seems promising, is that it's really difficult to know how to interpret results like these and know what the real-world impacts are and what the magnitude of these results are, because of a couple of things. One is that we don't have a control group to compare this to, and 2, that our N's, our sample sizes in each of the programs is fairly small. So it's really difficult for us to deduce that these types of findings are conclusive at this point in the evaluation. Next slide, please. Great. Programs also assessed acquisition of different skills. Those included cross-cultural communication, collaboration, leadership, digital literacy, problem solving, knowledge of global and local issues, and language improvement. Most youth reported gains in the skills assessed. Again, we do want folks to be aware that there's always a threat of self-reporting bias, so it's difficult to rely heavily on student surveys. For example, something that we noticed was many of the programs asked students to rate themselves on various skills pre- and post-program. And gains in this case were not very clear because students tended to rate themselves very high pre-program on all of these skills, which might mean that they're very skilled at it, but it could mean that they inflated their ratings a bit because of limited exposure to those skills, right? Like you might think that you're skilled at cross-cultural communication, but if you've had limited exposure, opportunity to actually engage in cross-cultural communication, to actually hone that skill, you might not know what it means to be good at it. You don't know what you don't know, right? So that's a consideration. There were also programs that just did the post surveys where students did report that they did see themselves improving quite a bit. This something that we just want people to keep in mind, that could be a result of students just having a positive attitude towards the program itself. So yeah, those are just things to keep in mind. Next slide, please. And then finally, additional qualitative data elevated some of the challenges and promising practices and responses. We had most awardees highlight struggles with marketing and messaging around programs, and then retention and recruitment in general. Many reported that a lack of the in-person exchange components as part of the general virtual exchange programs was sort of a barrier to participation. That seemed like a very appealing factor for a lot of people. Teacher engagement and retention also posed a challenge. It seemed that people didn't feel like teachers or professors are getting a very clear reward from participating in the program. There were folks who mentioned that providing certificates or micro-credentials to teacher might be a potential solution for that. Many reported that curriculum flexibility is super important, especially in programs where you're implementing the virtual exchange in a classroom, a pre-existing classroom context. Because in classrooms, you'll often get unexpected disruptions and schedules will shift, and if you have a very rigid curriculum, it can be very easily thrown off. Unsurprisingly, technology and its many challenges were frequently cited as one of the main hurdles that programs had to jump. That included a lot. Dropped internet connectivity, problems with video conference technology, procuring necessary hardware to implement the exchanges. There was also the issue of finding the right platform to conduct the exchange so that one group of students weren't at a disadvantage because of familiarity with that platform. And then security, of course, it was important for a lot of people to have a highly secure platform to ensure privacy and safety for the students. So yeah, that is a little bit of an overview of what that report entailed. We were able to glean these insights from the data sources that I had mentioned, but I think one of the most valuable reservoirs of data that we're currently filling and have filled so far is informational interviews with participants on the ground and focus groups. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jen,
Great.
who will talk a little bit about site visits.
Great. So I am just back from 2 amazing weeks in Morocco. Our colleague Christina Stearns was with me, and Catherine Borgen, if she's here, from the State Department was with us. Hi, Catherine. And there we were able to visit 6 of the 10 awardee programs. And again, we were able to observe the exchange, talk with students, talk with educators, other stakeholders. And we also have been doing US visits. So far, we have visited 4 of 10 awardee programs. We're going to do site visits again in the fall. I don't think we're going to be able to get to the Mena region again, unfortunately, but we will do more US site visits. So I want to lift up a couple very initial themes. I do want to acknowledge that we went to 1 MENA country and that the cultural and political context clearly would be different across other MENA countries. The US and Morocco have had a relatively long-standing, stable, and relatively positive political relationships, and that is not the case with all of the US and other MENA countries. So I want to acknowledge that what we gleaned from the ground in Morocco would certainly not be identical from what we would glean in the ground in other MENA countries. So first I'll tell you what we heard from students. We talked with a lot of them. They were very welcoming and generous with their time. When we asked what they feel they gained, and what they cited first was the cultural understanding and opportunities, appreciation for both sharing their own culture as well as learning more deeply about the US culture or other countries that they were engaged in with a same age peer and in a sort of personal way. They absolutely appreciated that. For the Morocco students, a really important outcome for them was to be able to practice their English orally and written, written and through posting, but orally and verbally. And they really gained a lot of confidence through that and felt very motivated to keep studying English. Particularly, we heard this strongly in Morocco, not so much in the US, but they feel like they gained a lot of confidence about expressing their ideas. They have less opportunities to do that in the Moroccan educational system compared to the US system, is what we've been learning. And they appreciated it and felt that they were really gaining those skills. Of course, there were different focus areas for each program. So depending on what they were studying, they did report that they were learning more about science or about using technology for civic life. And then what came across very strongly among the MENA was opportunities to work in teams and collaboration. Again, their education system does not do as much of that. I have teenagers in the American system, and they're at this point tired of teamwork and collaboration. But for the Moroccan students, this was unique, and they really appreciated that opportunity and recognized those as important skills. Teachers added a few additional gains that the students didn't quite articulate for themselves, but that I believe, because we observed some of it, was that although many of them have access to computers, much more limited than most US students, there often is a set of computers in a computer lab. They're older computers, they're not always linked to the internet, but they have that, and many of them do have phones and tablets, not all of them that we visited. But they haven't used them for things like research. And so the teachers were very excited for them to be able to learn those skills. Besides, they go on social networks, but they haven't deeply used the internet for research. So that was an important skill that the teachers saw them gaining. And other 21st century skills, inquiry, taking more initiative, again, inquiry-based practices in Moroccan schools are not as common. And so the teachers were very excited to have the opportunities and some curriculum developed for them to do that with the students, and the students responded very positively to that. The teachers, many of them cited that they were growing professionally. Some of the programs resulted in a certificate, which is meaningful to them and in their educational system. And they also, again, they would like to build in more inquiry-based approaches, but the national curriculum is very tight. And although they're undergoing reforms, just like probably every country is trying to undergo educational reforms, it's taking time to take hold. And so to have something, a curriculum provided for them that they could learn from was beneficial to them as educators. So we did not hear any student from the US that we've done site visits in or in Morocco who are done with exchanges. They would, many or all of it, I don't think I heard anyone say they don't want to do an in-person exchange. They are hungry for more opportunities, both in person and virtual. When we were describing who we were and that we were coming to study or to learn from different programs, when many of them didn't know that there were other virtual exchange programs, and so at the end of the focus group, they'd come up to us and say, so what other programs? And we'd pull up the Stevens Initiative website and say, well, you might want to check out this. And so they would love more opportunities. Almost all of the programs had a synchronous exchange, and we know those are challenging with time difference and technology, and they're so important. Without a doubt, that when we ask what the essential ingredients are, what's the most important piece, teachers and the students mentioned having an opportunity to talk at the same time with a video camera was critical. So for those of you who are doing that, thank you. I know it's challenging. For the few that maybe aren't, I want to suggest it's worth the blood, sweat, and tears to try to fit that in at least once and early on. It is important, we heard, to allow for one-on-one and small group interactions as opposed to assuming that just kind of bolting two classrooms together and having group discussions. The students need to get to know each other and start build trust and feel comfortable asking questions. And so building that in is really important. We heard among the US students where we've been able to do site visits before, we've heard an increase in other cultures and an increase in travel. The Moroccan youth in general already had that curiosity. But they became more confident in wanting to explore more opportunities for in-person and virtual exchanges. I think we're on our last slide. So yes, and this was brought up earlier, that there certainly were technology challenges, but we were amazed it did not stop anybody. They were entrepreneurial, they were flexible, they were going to solve this one way or another. Oftentimes it was, okay, the video conference isn't working on, so the teachers got on WhatsApp, which apparently everybody's using WhatsApp except me, I'm not sure that is, but they would then, they were very flexible about solving these problems. That was really impressive. And somebody mentioned another common challenge was, particularly in Morocco, was the bureaucracy in multiple levels. And again, folks were very creative and they know best how to work around those bureaucracies. So one really interesting anecdote I thought was they were having trouble within one region getting approval, and finally somebody who's involved in the project who's very well known called the embassy in the US, the Moroccan embassy in US, to say, hey, we've got this really important project, we're not getting approvals, and that then made things happen in his region, so that was smart. Okay.
Great. So technical hacking, political hacking, bureaucratic hacking, all excellent skills that you can impart to Americans as well, I think. Well, good. Well, thank you very much. Before we open it to you for questions, and I think especially comments going to the question posed actually by the RTI colleagues here, the question about why is it in particular, why do you think that Mena students might have expressed higher levels of satisfaction overall than the Americans? But let's hold that out there for you all to think about for a second. But I was intrigued by your comments about cultural competence, cultural responsiveness, and just say a little bit more about how you do that. How do you ensure that the evaluation is culturally responsive and appropriate across these very diverse contexts in which you're working?
Yeah, so I absolutely don't think we've perfected it or cracked the nut in this project or ever, but I think, as David mentioned, being aware of our blind spots and being curious and engaging and requesting that stakeholders who have more of that cultural experience is critical. So, for example, one way when we were coming into Morocco, we requested a few phone calls ahead of time with folks who have worked in Morocco or are in Morocco to say, you know, what would be a comfortable way for us to introduce ourselves. We understand that students aren't used to something like a focus group, so what should we do to make them very comfortable? So one thing we did was, we didn't want to use the term "we're assessing you" or "evaluating you," and what we really said.
Well, evaluators never want to say that.
Right. You know, we're here to learn from you, and so you're the experts. And then when we would ask what are the challenges, and they would say, oh, no, it's perfect. We'd say, come on, please, you know, we know nothing's perfect. And so we would just be a little more patient and encouraging. And we also made sure that we had a Moroccan translator with us. And he has experience with the Stevens Initiative, so he has the content information. And while many of the students were anxious to use English, we wanted them to be able to express themselves as deeply as possible. So often it would move into Arabic, and that worked much better. We do think there's much more to be done. In particular, this study, you know, needs to be located within a broader research agenda and field, and what we think would really be great is to involve some researchers from the Mena region so that it's truly cross-cultural in that sense, that there's some US researchers and also researchers in Mena who are working together to understand virtual exchanges.
Something that I would love to add, and I think it's implied, but I just want to make it explicit, is two things that we're very conscious of when we talk about intentionality around cultural competence. Is that one, culture is not static or monolithic, right? We don't assume that everyone in the Mena region shares a common culture. There's nuance there, and culture plays a different role in the data depending on those contexts, similar in the US, right? That's one thing. So we know that there's a lot of nuance, and that's why we're very intentional about engaging stakeholders and hearing from folks on the ground. The other thing is that we're also very aware that our own cultural lens impacts how we approach the evaluation. It impacts what questions we ask, how we structure everything, and we're in a constant state of self-interrogation and examination of how we're doing things, and that's another reason why, again, we're very intentional about talking to folks who are actually doing the heavy lifting.
Right. Good. And out of this, since you, obviously early days, first semi-annual report, but are there early findings that from which you can derive recommendations either for Stevens or for the field more broadly, or is that just premature?
Yeah, I think we have some that we're very comfortable sharing, and a couple of them I'd mentioned, so I'll just quickly tag them off. Make sure that there are opportunities early for individual or small group connections, not just sort of bolting two classes together, because it builds trust and comfort with exchanging ideas and cultural information. Build in synchronous exchanges, and we suggest that this collaborative, in particular, think about some warm handoff opportunities, because there are a number of programs serving post-secondary and young adults, and there could be, we know that this group wants more and more opportunities, so thinking about ways of some warm handoffs. We also suggest, and there are a couple groups that are doing this, think about youth leadership opportunities in your programs. For example, some of the programs that are, I'm thinking of the Chicago Sister Cities, which is a full year program. There are some really awesome engaged students who I think could be be involved as maybe a youth advisory group for the next round of participants. They have wonderful ideas about new content areas, and I think getting that opportunities for youth leadership and youth voice in program design would be awesome. And then we have some suggestions around evaluation that we'll be tackling with the evaluation learning group.
Right, good. Oh, good. We can open it to the floor, and I see hands already are rising. So do please wait for the mic. I think we have one in the back, and I saw one here, here, here. Okay, let me try to come back to you more or less in order. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Billy Clark, and I'm the Artistic Director of Culture Hub, which is based at La Mama Experimental Theater in New York. And we founded in 2009, and the primary focus of our work is artistic collaboration over distance, both for education but also for art making, actually making pieces that are distributed and utilizing the internet as a means for that distribution. And so I'm interested in the synchronous aspect in particular, which is very challenging. And through our practice, we've become frustrated with the tools that were there, so much so that we've started developing our own open source tool. And so I wonder, in your evaluation process, if the existent tools that people are using, if those are being rigorously evaluated, and if there's a way that those lessons learned or things like that could be shared, if that's part of your plan. I saw that it was to a certain extent, but I'm curious more about that.
Yeah, so we're not ourselves doing usability testing, but we're certainly asking about that. And through one of the reflection sections that came up about, so there is already a small table that we've prepared that describe the different platforms that people are using, and it seems like in some countries a platform works better than others, so I'd be happy to share that with you. And then other programs have a particular platform that works for their project because they're sharing digital artifacts. So some have taken platforms that existed for distance collaboration and modified them for this purpose. But I don't think that there's identified sort of one single platform that works, in all these different areas. So we've had groups say we found that Google Hangout was better than Skype, or vice versa, depending on which region, countries they're working with.
While the mic passes up here to the very front, if you don't mind. We've done a series of webinars with colleagues in East and West Africa, and a woman in Dakar said, the internet here is moody. Yes.
Hi. One of the goals of the Stevens Initiative, and certainly of the evaluation team...
I'm sorry, would you mind identifying yourself?
Allison Church, SUNY Coyle. One of the goals is to measure sustainability and ways in which things are sustained. Now, as you can imagine, many of the awardees in the room certainly don't want their project to go away once the funding does. And so in what way are you measuring sustainability over time? For example, in Coyle, fall 2017, or fall 2016, Professor X does a Coyle program. It reaches X number of students. Those X number of students then go on to their other courses and other subjects the next year. Professor X wants to continue coiling on their campus. How are you measuring that? And then how are you measuring the ripple effect that happens within the campus community and the community at large over a long period of time? Certainly, I'm sure that there are effects that are happening in the short term in the community. There certainly are with Coyle. But what are your objectives in staying connected with people and awardees after the program's over?
Yeah.
Great.
Good. So I can take a shot, and then others feel. Our study isn't long enough for us to be able to build in too much data collection beyond, but we certainly have asked about sustainability when we've been on site, how once the Stevens Initiative funding goes away, to what extent do you think you're going to be able to sustain these, and how, and what types of partnerships have you developed that you think, or what types of structures exist that you think will help you continue to do this work. And in Morocco, there is a group teachers of English language, and they've started something called English Circles, which essentially are clubs that teachers can facilitate, and they want to have some of these programs continue in those clubs. In terms of the ripple effects, we asked about that while we were on the ground, and you asked students in particular, have you talked to your family about this? Do you talk to other friends? What have you said, and what's been their reaction? And we hear that maybe they're more talkative to their parents than American students. So they said, I tell my parents all the time, they're really excited for me. They're asking what I'm learning. They're encouraging me to keep doing this, and that within their school, folks are getting more and more interested, and they'll come peer when there's a video conference coming in and they want to be involved. So we certainly heard ripple effects in terms of interest. We asked a little bit on the ground about, but maybe we should think more clearly about asking programs quantitatively to help us think about this, about retention. So for teachers, how many, once they've done it once, what for one term, what proportion return back to do it another. And so I think that's an important perspective for us to think about, how to ask programs to help us think about that more deeply.
Hi, my name is Peter Sullivan, and there was a lot of great data. Thank you. My question is there, with the statistical process tools you use, is there a way to transfer that, to train the people on the ground to evaluate their own failures and successes for their given agendas?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think now that we've had this first round of survey data, we will bring it back to the evaluation learning group. And that's really the venue we're using to be able to provide some level of technical assistance around evaluation. But that's really one representative from each awardee. So we should, we haven't yet gotten to the point of thinking how to support them or encourage them to work with their partners to be able to develop those capabilities also. So that's an important point.
Great. I'm going to take one more question on this side, and then I'll turn to this side.
Thank you very much, Kamil Adai from Global Institute for Health and Human Rights. Given the topic of the panel is evaluation, and this is the lesson we learned from the first year round, my question is, if I am correct, is 6 out of 10 awardees are from Morocco. And given we talk about MENA, it's 23 countries. Was there any reason for that, or should we look at the diversity?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. The resources for the evaluation only involved one trip, and Stephen's initiative, and we agreed, selected Morocco because that's where we could see the most number of programs. So we are collecting the survey data from all the programs, including in the different countries they are. And I think while we can't do another international trip, I think we could do some virtual site visits with some of the programs in other countries. That's not, we know that won't get nearly as rich of data.
So my point is about the policy of awarding for the next round, not for evaluation. My point is because, excuse me, so to make it clear, my point is 6 out of 10 is from Morocco, but we have 23 countries. Is there any policy for next round to have more diverse awardees from different countries? That was my question.
Good. I'm going to turn to Henry to respond to that question.
It's such an important question that I want to make sure we jump in from the Stevens Initiative side.
Yes.
I think my microphone just back on. While we have 7 of our 10 awardees running programs in Morocco, many of those programs reach multiple countries. And so our programs collectively reach 19 countries across the region and 29 US states. So while Morocco is the most represented, it's by no means the majority of the programs. It's just that the majority of programs have some activities in Morocco. Again, there are programs across 19 countries across the region. And the data reflects much of that on the screen that you saw earlier. And there's more data to add for this current semester, which wasn't reflected in the data, as well as next semester. And spreading to more countries is certainly a high priority for future rounds of funding.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And I think we had a question right here. Is there a microphone handy for the woman in the second row? That woman.
Hi, Shari Tishman, a co-director of the Out of Eden Learn project at Harvard University. First, a note of appreciation because you're tackling a really complex problem space and your evaluation is really interestingly mixed and I think very rich, so it's really cool to see that. I'm going to go back to something you mentioned earlier, and I'm really interested in the relationship, and I realize this is a little bit premature, but I'm interested in the relationship between the dramatic stories and the surveys. I'm wondering if you are finding anything in the stories that you're collecting that can help people think about survey design, because as you pointed out, many, if not all of the projects here use surveys.
Yeah. That's an important point. We know, I think we have more to think about quickly before maybe the next fall of surveys. We do, there are opportunities in surveys to ask open-ended questions, and so that would be getting sort of more qualitative data from more people. It can be a bit overwhelming to know how to analyze that, so we're trying to both satisfy collecting some information from a wide group that can be quantified on some level, because a lot of stakeholders want to see some numbers. So we're trying to do that along with the more deeper dives through most significant change stories and the qualitative interviews. In terms of whether some of what we're hearing from some of that, I mean, folks are so articulate about how important and deep this experience has been, and helped and been meaningful for them in terms of reflecting on their own culture. I heard that more than I expected to hear. So I think, I'm not sure we have survey items related to that, so that might be something we want to think about.
I would just say absolutely, we will try to use the information we get from all of the qualitative work to inform recommendations about refinement of surveys. I think there are some things we've learned about the quality of the measures in some cases, like the lack of differentiation. If everyone is answering that they think highly of their experience from the beginning, or of their skills from the beginning, it's not really a good survey question. So we'll make recommendations about that. We'll make recommendations based on things that we think would be interesting to incorporate from our qualitative study.
All right, good. Yes, just keeping the mic on this side here.
I'm just curious. I'm Peg Peoples again. I'm from Bard College, and because I run a professional development institute and engage in a lot of education initiatives, I'm curious. One of the key things here is, in learning all these new skills is, are you looking forward to, or have you already begun to think about how teachers and students are transferring these skills? Is there a level of transfer going on into other courses?
Yeah.
That seems really kind of key, and I'm wondering if you've already gotten at least survey information from that survey data.
Other courses or other behaviors that would represent a carryover.
As a transfer of skills, I mean, that seems to be at the heart, of this is,
Right. We did ask and hear some of that from the educators saying, I have, but now I'm more comfortable and I've used some of the technology, doing internet searches in some of my other classes with students. We asked students, has your behavior changed in any way, and can you describe that? And maybe we didn't ask it clearly, but it was hard for them to answer in a way. We did, many of them would, by themselves, say, I now, when I'm at home, I spend time doing internet research. They wouldn't call it research, but I look for things in the internet and I found things, as opposed to what I used to just do was get on Facebook. And so we heard that, but we had a hard time. I don't think we've yet figured out how to ask students about that.
Well, I am told we have a minute. We're going to take one more question right there. Sorry about that. Yeah.
We're happy to answer questions during the break.
Sure. Let's take this one.
Sorry. That was my mistake.
Sorry about that.
Sorry to steal the mic, but Jody Sanger with the Institute of International Education. But I'm actually asking this question on behalf of Solia program because I also facilitate with them. Going back to the deepness aspect that you mentioned, people liked being able to talk about these issues deeply. I feel like one of the things that I encounter with American students is they feel like they can't get to that deepness, perhaps because when they talk in like a really like high English, they're not understood in the session. And I feel like it's a frustration that I come up with a lot. And I wondered if in doing your evaluation between programs, if there was any control between when there was or was not an interpreter, I guess a translator available, and whether or not that changed.
Yeah.
Not just the satisfaction of the Arabic speakers, but also the English speakers in the group.
Yeah, that's a really important question, and maybe because we haven't done as many U.S. site visits, that hasn't bubbled up so clearly to us, but it makes sense. We can look to see whether we can ask programs to clarify whether their programs include a translator. And I know some of the platforms had, they were using Google Translate, and that was helpful for some of the students. So that sounds like a really important thing for us to consider.
Great question.
Great. Good. Well, thank you. Thank you for, as a person in the evaluation field, I'm always delighted when actually people appear interested in evaluation. So thank you so much for your attention.